9:02 hours. July 18, 1943. A low ridge west of a nameless village, 45 kilometers south of Orel, on the Eastern Front. Unteroffizier Karl Reimann, age 26, pressed his back against the cold steel of his Panzer IV's turret and checked his watch for the third time in a minute. The second hand swept past the 12. The sky above the Russian treeline was a flat, gray lid. The air smelled of burned fuel, wet soil, and cordite residue from the morning's artillery preparation. His tank was a Panzer Kampfwagen IV Ausf. H, weighing a little over 25 tons. The long 7.5 centimeters KWK-40L/48 gun projected like a spear from the turret, its double-baffle muzzle brake crusted with soot. 80 millimeters of steel plate, bolted and welded and overlaid with Scherzen side skirts, separated Reimann and his crew from the outside world. Inside, there were 5 men in a space barely larger than a small delivery van. At 9:03, he ducked back into the turret and rotated in his seat. "Gunner ready?" he asked. "Bereit," said Gefreiter Vogel, 22 years old, his right eye pressed to the TZF-5F sight. AP loaded. Panzergranate 39, armor-piercing capped ballistic cap, 6.8 kilograms of steel and explosive filler, muzzle velocity around 750 meters per second. Against the armor of a Soviet T-34, at 800 to 1,000 meters, it could punch through the side plate like cardboard, if he could hit it. "Radio?" Reimann asked. "Net is quiet, Herr Unteroffizier," replied Funker, radio operator, Schütze Kramer, sitting cramped in the bow. His hand hovered over the throat microphone of the Fug 5 set. "Company has us on receive only. No chatter." "Good." Silence was part of the plan. The plan had been laid out at 6:10, around a rough map spread over the engine deck of a command tank. The Soviet forces, identified as elements of a tank brigade supporting a rifle division, were pushing west in a series of probing attacks after the German defensive line bent under pressure during Operation Kutuzov. A narrow dirt road cut through a shallow valley between 2 ridges. It was the obvious route for any armored thrust. 2/Panzer Regiment 11 had 3 serviceable Panzer IVs in this sector. Just 3. Most of the battalion strength was already committed or in repair. The regimental commander decided to use them not as a blunt shield, but as a knife. At 7:25, Reimann's tank, call sign Bertha 2-3, rolled into position on the reverse slope of the southern ridge, 1,200 meters east of the road. The ground was soft, the hull sinking slightly into the damp earth. The driver, Oberstfreiter Lenz, edged the tank forward until only the upper half of the turret and the gun could see over the crest, a classic hull-down ambush position. To their left, 400 meters away, another Panzer IV dug in among a stand of birch trees. To their right, unseen but present over the radio net, was the third tank, hidden behind a ruined farmhouse and its collapsed stone wall. Together, they formed a shallow arc overlooking the expected Soviet axis of advance. "Range markers, 200 meters spacing," Vogel muttered to himself, adjusting the sight drum. He had carefully noted the range to several distinctive features as the tank crept into position: a solitary oak tree at 1,000 meters, a small haystack at 900, a burnt-out truck just off the road at 800. The trees beyond, where the road curved out of sight, sat at roughly 1,500. At 8:12, German artillery had hammered the treeline beyond the bend. The shells had walked back and forth for 6 minutes, churning the soil and cutting branches. Then silence. No follow-on barrage. No smoke screen. Just the faint crackle of burning underbrush and the occasional pop of ammunition cooking off in some abandoned position. The ambush depended on this silence now, on convincing the Soviet tank crews that the Germans were thin, disorganized, and falling back. At 9:07, Reimann raised his Zeissfield glasses to the slit of open sky above the glacis. His stomach tightened. He heard it before he saw it, the distant clatter of tracks, a metallic rattle carried on the wind. "Engine, ready to move on my order," he said. "Joel," Lenz replied quietly. The Maybach HL-120 TRM engine idled beneath them, 12 cylinders of petrol burning power capable of 300 horsepower at 3,000 revolutions per minute. In this position, movement would be measured in meters, not kilometers. But those meters could be the difference between life and death. At 9:09, the first Soviet T-34 rolled into view. It came around the curve like a gray-green animal, the 76.2 mm F-34 gun pointed lazily forward, turret hatch open. The T-34 weighed about 26 tons, similar to the Panzer IV, but its armor was sloped, a 45 mm frontal plate angled at 60 degrees, effectively increasing its resistance. Its Christie suspension carried wide tracks that spread its weight over soft ground. To the Soviets, the T-34 was the workhorse of their armored forces. To German tankers, it was a respected, dangerous enemy. Reimann exhaled slowly. The distance from his gun muzzle to the T-34's flank, as the Soviet tank began to pass directly in front of his position, was just over 900 meters. The side armor on the T-34's hull, 40 to 45 millimeters and roughly vertical, was vulnerable at that range. Gunner, T-34, left to right, 900 meters. Aim center hull, below the turret. Do not fire until I give the order. Ziel erkannt, Vogel said. Target identified. Behind the first T-34, more machines appeared. 1, then 3, then 5. A column. Platoons strung out along the road, about 50 meters between each tank, dust rising in thin sheets from their tracks. Some had tank riders on the engine decks, infantry clutching rifles. Others were bare. Count? Reimann asked. The loader, Grenadier Hoffmann, craned his neck at his own periscope for a glimpse. 6, 8, more coming, Herr Unteroffizier. I see at least 12 so far. The ambush plan required discipline. The first shot would be the signal. There would be no ranging rounds. No warnings. The goal was to deliver a sudden, devastating blow that would throw the Soviet column into confusion before they could react, disperse, or traverse their guns onto the German positions. At 9:11, the first T-34 reached the burnt-out truck by the roadside, the one Vogel had marked at 800 meters. Its broad left flank now exposed to Bertha II-3's waiting gun. Loader, AP ready, Hoffmann said, although the shell was already in the breech, brass casing hot against steel. Reimann watched the column lengthen. More tanks still emerged from the tree-lean bend. His jaw clenched as he made a quick calculation. If they waited until the middle of the column was exposed, they could trap the front and rear vehicles and turn the stretch of road into a killing ground. But delay also meant risk. Any Soviet reconnaissance or infantry screen might notice the telltale smudge of their exhaust, the slight unnatural silhouette on the ridge. At 9:12, he saw what he had been waiting for. A T-34 with a white tactical number 221, painted on the turret past the oak tree at 1,000 meters. 2 more tanks were just clearing the bend. Ahead, a gap had opened to the lead tank near the truck, widening to nearly 100 meters, a natural separation in the column, perhaps caused by terrain or a cautious driver. It was enough. Gunner, Reimann said quietly. Target the second tank behind the gap. Turret ring. Range 1,000. On my command. Ziel aufgesetzt, Vogel replied. Target laid on. The crosshairs settled over the invisible ring of steel where turret met hull. A shot there could jam the turret or blow it clean off. Reimann took one more look through his binoculars at the line of Soviet tanks stretched out along the road. Smoke from their exhausts drifted low. Their guns still pointed forward. No one, yet, looked up at the ridge. He lowered the glasses. At my command, he repeated. Fire. 9:13 hours. Vogel's right hand tightened on the elevation wheel. His foot hovered over the trigger pedal. Reimann counted under his breath. 1, 2, 3. Fewer. The gun thundered. The 7.5 centimeters KWK-40 recoiled 30 centimeters into the turret, its hydraulic recuperator hissing as it slammed back into battery. The entire tank jolted. Empty shell casings rattled in their racks. A blast of fumes rolled into the fighting compartment, harsh and metallic. Through his sight, Vogel saw the armor-piercing round streak invisibly across the 1,000-meter gap. A moment later, he saw the impact. The Panzergranate 39 struck the T-34's turret ring on the left side, just below the commander's hatch. The Soviet tank shuddered. A geyser of sparks and fragments erupted. For half a second, nothing else happened. Then the turret lifted. It did not blow off completely, but it jumped several centimeters, twisted, and jammed at an angle. Flames licked out from under the ring. The Soviet turret gun sagged. The tank slewed slightly to the right as its driver lost control. Treffer, Vogel called. Hit. Loader, AP. Hoffman had already swung his body to the ready rack, yanked another 75mm round free, and rammed it into the open breech. He slapped the block closed with the heel of his hand. Fertig. Next target, Reimann snapped. Lead tank. 800. Aim for the fuel tanks. At 9 hours 13 minutes and 22 seconds, the second shot left the barrel. Again the recoil slammed through the hull. Hoffman's shoulder hit the side wall. He barely noticed. The round struck the rear left flank of the lead T-34, just above the track, where the cylindrical external fuel tanks were mounted. The impact punched through the armor and into the engine bay. A bright flash blossomed. Diesel fuel and oil erupted in a billowing fireball. The tank stopped dead in the road, engine coughing once, then dying. "Two burning," Vogel reported. Reimann didn't answer. He was already scanning for the third shot. On the road, the Soviet column reacted a second too late. The third T-34 in line, which had been following at about 60 meters, tried to brake. Its tracks dug into the dirt. It swerved left, off the road, searching blindly for cover that didn't exist. At 9:14, the second German Panzer IV on the left, call sign Bertha 2-1, opened up. Its first round hit the third Soviet tank square in the hull, just under the turret. The T-34's side armor at that angle offered no resistance. The shell tore through the crew compartment and detonated inside. The turret blew off its ring and landed in the ditch, a blackened disk of steel. 3 tanks destroyed in less than a minute. The Soviet crews began to understand. Turrets rotated. Guns traversed. Tank commanders ducked into their hatches. Some infantry riders jumped off and ran for the tree-line. But the Germans had picked their ground carefully. The ridgeline where Reimann's tanks lay hull down offered little silhouette to fire at, only a narrow band of dark steel and muzzle flash framed against the sky. The distance, 800 to 1,200 meters, was ideal for the Panzer IV's high-velocity gun, but marginal for the older F-34 guns on the T-34s trying to pick out a small target hastily. Gunner, second vehicle behind the burning lead. Same range, Reimann said. Aim for the front of the hull. Driver's station. Ziel aufsetzt, Vogel replied. At 9 hours 14 minutes and 37 seconds, the third shot went out. The T-34 had just begun to turn its turret toward the ridge. The German round slammed into the glacis between the driver's hatch and the bow machine gun. The sloped 45mm plate was strong, but at that distance and angle, the 75mm AP round still had enough energy. It punched in, shattered, and sprayed the interior with fragments. The Soviet tank rolled another 5 meters before it stopped, smoke pooling inside the hull. No one climbed out. 3, Hoffman muttered as he rammed another shell. Sweat ran down the side of his face, cutting a trail through the dust. On the radio net, brief, controlled voices crackled. Bertha 2-1 to 2-3, 3 confirmed. Engaging rear of column. Bertha 2-2, 2 confirmed. Continue fire. Keep intervals. The third German tank, unseen behind the farmhouse, now joined the ambush. Its first shot shattered the track of the last T-34 in the visible line. The Soviet tank lurched, its left track dragging off the road. It slewed sideways and blocked the path of the tanks behind it. In the span of 90 seconds, the Soviet column had been cut and blocked at both ends. Flames rose from 4 wrecks. The surviving T-34s were trapped in a narrow killing zone, unable to accelerate forward or retreat without pushing disabled hulks out of the way. At 9:15, the situation turned from an ambush into a systematic slaughter. Reimann kept his voice flat. "Gunner, work front to rear. Don't rush. Aim carefully. Loader, keep up. Driver, hold position unless I say otherwise." "Joel," came 3 overlapping replies. The gun cycled. "Fire. Recoil. Breech open. Brass casing out. New round in. Breech closed." Each firing cycle took roughly 6 to 8 seconds in ideal conditions. In the cramped, vibrating interior, with the tank's turret rotating and the floor cluttered with empty casings, it was closer to 10. Hoffmann worked like a machine, arms and back straining against the weight of the shells. The Soviets tried to respond. At 9 hours 15 minutes and 32 seconds, a T-34 in the middle of the column fired uphill. The 76.2 mm He round exploded short, in front of Bertha II-3's position. Dirt and shrapnel spattered the glacis. The shock waves slammed against the hull, but the armor held. "Short by 50, Vogel said calmly, readjusting his sight. Another T-34, further back, tried to charge out of the line. Its driver gunned the engine, attempting to swing off the road and cut perpendicular across the valley floor. That maneuver exposed its flank fully. At 9:16, Bertha II-3 killed it with a single round through the side of the turret. The shell detonated inside the ammunition racks. The turret roof peeled open like a tin can. A plume of black smoke climbed into the sky. By 9:17, 7 Soviet tanks were burning or disabled. German doctrine in such a moment emphasized fire discipline and economy. Panzer crews were trained to prioritize targets. Vehicles escaping the kill zone, those whose guns were bearing on German positions, command tanks with additional antennae. Reimann followed that doctrine, but he also had to contend with the reality that his crew was still human, breathing hard, hearts pounding, ears ringing from the blasts. "Bertha II-3, this is 2-1. Rear of column attempting to reverse," the radio crackled. "Understood," Reimann replied. "We will focus center. Keep the ends blocked." At 9:18, a Soviet tank in the rear managed to push the crippled last vehicle slightly aside. Track spun, throwing dirt. It had almost enough room to squeeze past. The third German tank corrected its aim and fired again. The round hit the escaping T-34's exposed side. The tank lurched, then went still. Smoke trickled from the engine compartment. On the ridge, the 2 forward Panzer IVs continued their methodical work. Their gun barrels glowed faintly from the repeated firing, heat shimmering around the muzzle brakes. "Range 900. Slight left." "That one is still moving," Reimann said at 9 hours 18 minutes and 24 seconds, nodding toward AT-34, whose turret was still rotating despite the chaos. "Aim hull front. Stop him." Vogel adjusted. Fired. This time the shot hit low, smashing the T-34's right track and blowing off several road wheels. The enemy tank collapsed onto its side, immobilized. Its guns still pointed in their general direction, but without the ability to move, it became a static target. "Hit the turret next," Reimann ordered. "Make sure they stay inside." By 9:19, the Soviet column had turned into a line of burning wrecks and twisted hulks stretching for several hundred meters along the road. In the valley, fuel burned in pools. Ammunition cooked off in sudden secondary detonations, sending flashes and shards high into the air. Still, here and there, some T-34s tried to fight back. One managed to get off 2 more shots. The first went wild. The second landed just to the right of the farmhouse, hiding the third German tank, blowing out the last standing wall. Debris rained down on the Panzer IV's hull, but its armor remained intact. Inside Bertha II-3, the air had become a hot, metallic fog. The ventilator struggled to keep up with the fumes. Sweat ran into eyes. Ears rang with a constant dull roar. "Loader, how many AP left in the ready rack?" Reimann asked at 9 hours 19 minutes and 41 seconds. Hoffmann glanced quickly. 5 here. More in the hull racks. Stay on AP. We finish this. At 9:20, After roughly 7 minutes of continuous engagement, Bertha 2-3 had fired 18 rounds. Of those, Vogel and Reimann believed at least 12 had been solid hits that disabled or destroyed their targets. The other two German tanks together had fired a similar number. The total number of Soviet tanks knocked out in that first phase, burning, immobilized, or abandoned, stood at around 24. The broader battle, though, was not yet decided. At 9:21, Kramer's voice sharpened on the intercom. Radio traffic, Herr Unteroffizier. Intercepted Soviet chatter. Sounds like more armor coming up behind them. And our company net says enemy infantry is moving on our flanks. Reimann absorbed that in a moment of cold clarity. The ambush had been devastating, but it had also revealed their positions. The enemy would not march blindly into that valley twice. Then we use the time we bought, he said. He leaned into the commander's periscope again. Down below, torn T-34s burned in the road like a twisted metal barricade. Figures, Soviet tankers and infantry, ran for the tree-line or crawled along ditches, trying to escape the inferno. The 15 minutes that would define this action were only half spent. 9 hours, 21 minutes, and 30 seconds hours. The echoes of the last shot still rolled across the valley when Reimann made his next decision. Gunner, switch targets, he ordered. Infantry in the ditches. Use cokes. Short bursts. We can't let them get up this slope. Jawl, Vogel said, lifting his head from the main gun sight and swinging to the coaxial MG-34 trigger. The MG-34, chambered in 7.92 by 57 mm, sat rigidly mounted next to the main gun. Its belt fed through a guide track from a box on the turret wall. Vogel squeezed the trigger. The machine gun barked, cycling at close to 800 rounds per minute. Tracer rounds stitched the ditch line beside the burning tanks. Through his periscope, Reimann saw dark figures trying to hug the roadside embankment. Some fell still. Others crawled back toward the tree-line, leaving their rifles. Enough, he said after a few seconds. Back to the gun. More armor coming. At 9:22, the first of the second wave of Soviet tanks nosed out of the smoke at the far bend in the road. These were also T-34s, but painted in fresher green, some with rough white aerial recognition marks on the engine deck. They advanced slower, 10 to 15 kilometers per hour, guns already elevated toward the ridgeline. They had learned something from the first wave's fate. Range? Reimann asked. Vogel checked the sight scale, comparing the apparent size of the tank's turret against the reticle. About 1,300 meters, he said. Slightly longer. That pushed the KWK-40 closer to the limit of reliable penetration against the T-34's sloped frontal armor. Side shots would still be lethal, but the new tanks were careful to keep their noses pointed toward the ridge as they fanned out. At 9 hours 22 minutes and 40 seconds, a shell from one of the new T-34s exploded near Bertha 2-1 on the left. The blast threw earth and splinters across the birch trees. The German tank rocked. 2-1 hit, but still combat-worthy, came the terse report over the radio. Reimann made his call. Driver, back us down 5 meters. Then 3 meters right. Alternate position. Lenz didn't argue. He dropped the Panzer IV into reverse. The Maybach engine growled. The tank slid carefully down the reverse slope, out of sight of the valley, then nudged sideways. The movement took less than 20 seconds, but it broke the pattern of where the Soviets expected to see muzzle flashes. Stop. Hold. Gunner, be ready. We crest by half a meter only, Reimann said. At 9:23, Bertha 2-3 edged up again. Only the strip of turret and the tip of the muzzle cleared the ridge. Now their view of the road was slightly offset. They saw the new Soviet tanks at a small angle instead of head-on. Gunner, take the one angling left, Reimann said. He's showing a bit of side. Range 1,200. Aim lower hull. Ziel aufsetzt. Fire. The 19th round left the barrel. At this range, drop was more of a factor. Vogel accounted for it with a slight adjustment in elevation. The AP round arced and struck the T-34's left front hull, just behind the angled armor plate, where the side plate began. The shell punched through and detonated in the fighting compartment. The Soviet tank hiccuped, then came to a halt, a jet of fire bursting from the driver's hatch. "Loader! AP in." "Ready," Hoffman grunted, breathing hard. His shoulders burned with each heavy round he lifted from the turret rack. His tunic was dark with sweat. "Next one to the right," Reimann said. "He's still moving." At 9 hours 23 minutes and 42 seconds, they fired again. This time the round hit higher than intended, smashing into the T-34's gun mantlet. The impact tore off part of the Soviet gun barrel, bending it into a grotesque hook. The tank stopped, turret frozen mid-traverse. "Gun out of action," Vogel reported. "We can leave him." The second German tank, Bertha 2-1, rejoined, pouring fire into the clustered Soviets from the left. The third tank behind the farmhouse focused on any vehicle that tried to reverse out of the jam. The ambush zone had widened. Now it was not just the original 800-meter strip, but a 500-meter deep pocket where Soviet tanks, forced by wrecks and terrain, presented their flanks and rears in chaotic moments. At 9:24, a T-34 finally got a range on Bertha 2-3's new position. "Incoming!" Kramer shouted over the intercom. The Soviet 76.2 mm round smashed into the ground just below the Panzer IV's gun. The explosion sent dirt and rocks slamming into the hull. A fragment struck the lower edge of the gun mantlet, throwing a shower of spall inside. Kramer grunted. A hot splinter cut across his left cheek, leaving a thin red line. He wiped at the blood with the back of his hand and went back to the radio. "Funker verwundet, light," he reported automatically. "Radio operator wounded, light." "Stay on your set," Reimann said. "We're not done." At 9 hours 24 minutes and 30 seconds, another Soviet round hit closer, this time to the right. The concussion rang through the hull. The Panzer IV's armor, 50 mm on the turret front, up-armored with an additional 30 mm plate, held, but everyone inside felt the blow in their teeth. "Gunner, that one," Reimann said, forcing his voice to remain calm as he spotted the firing T-34 through dust and smoke. "The one that just fired. Slight right, 1,100. Turret base." "On target," Vogel replied. "Shot. Recoil. Impact." The shell struck the T-34 at the base of its turret. The turret jerked, then froze. Smoke poured from the commander's cupola. A figure tried to climb out, then slipped and disappeared. By 9:25, Bertha 2-3's kill tally had climbed again. The crew didn't stop to count, but someone would later, the turret wall chalkboard where Hoffman scratched a line for each confirmed wreck. There were already more than 20 marks. The second wave of Soviet tanks fared little better than the first. They had the advantage of knowing hostile guns were on the ridge, but not exactly where. The Germans enjoyed the higher ground, better optics, and a gun that, in this band of range, could still neutralize a T-34 with a single hit. At 9:26, the battlefield reached a gruesome crescendo. The road was completely blocked by double and triple stacked wrecks. Some T-34s sat at odd angles, tracks shredded, hulls resting half on the backs of earlier casualties. Others burned so hot the paint ran in rivulets. Ammunition detonations came at irregular intervals, sharp, popping blasts that threw pieces of track and turret skyward. Forced off the road, the last arriving Soviet tanks tried to bypass the carnage by driving straight across the fields. But the soil there had been churned by earlier shelling. Soft patches caught tracks. One tank bogged down to the hull and became a stationary target. Another ground its way forward only 5 meters at a time, fully exposed. Between 9:26 and 9:28, Bertha 2-3 fired another 8 AP rounds. One smashed into the side of a bogged-down T-34, which blew apart in a geyser of fire. Another hit a tank attempting to angle up the opposite ridge, punching through its rear armor. A third shell, aimed at a moving target at nearly 1,400 meters, clipped the rear of the turret and set off the ammunition stored there. In those 2 minutes, 3 more Soviet tanks became burning wrecks. At 9:28, After roughly 15 minutes since the first shot at 9:13, the main phase of the ambush had run its course. The valley below was a landscape of twisted steel and fire. The initial company report, sent hurriedly over the net, estimated that between the 3 Panzer IVs, more than 40 enemy tanks had been destroyed or disabled. Later, when the smoke cleared and officers walked the ground with binoculars and notebooks, they would count carefully. They would separate those clearly killed by infantry anti-tank weapons or artillery from those showing neat 75mm penetrations from the ridgeline. The tally they assigned to Bertha 2 to 3 alone, whether by exact analysis or by a degree of legend, was 37 T-34s knocked out in that 15-minute window. Inside the tank, though, there was no triumph, only exhaustion and a lingering awareness that they were still under threat. Ammo status, Reimann asked at 9 hours 28 minutes and 10 seconds. Ready rack almost dry, Hoffman replied. We have to go to the floor racks. Maybe 20 AP left, total. Fuel? Reimann asked. Plenty, Lenz answered. But I don't like sitting here. They'll bring artillery down on this ridge any minute. As if on cue, Kramer spoke up. Company net says Soviet infantry massing in the woods to our north and south. Possible flanking attacks. We are ordered to displace to phase line Olga and prepare a new position. Reimann nodded slowly. The job of a panzer platoon in a defensive battle like this was not to die gloriously on a ridge. It was to delay, to bleed the attacker, and then to fall back before being encircled. Driver, reverse down the slope, he ordered at 9:29. Gunner, keep the gun facing the valley. Loader, he on standby in case infantry close in. Funker, acknowledge order and report our ammo and status. The Maybach engine revved. The Panzer IV backed away from the lip of the ridge, leaving behind a position littered with spent shell casings and the scorched impression of its tracks. As Bertha 2 to 3 slipped out of sight, Soviet shells began to fall in earnest on the crest they had just vacated. The ridge line flowered with explosions. Dirt and rock leapt into the air where the tank had been minutes before. By 9:31, the immediate danger was behind them. The larger battle, however, was still raging all along the sector. In the regimental war diary that evening, the entry for this engagement would be brief. A note about 3 Panzer IVs halting a Soviet tank thrust, an estimate of enemy losses, and a comment that the defensive value of well-sighted Panzer IVs, even in small numbers, remains considerable against superior enemy tank forces. But among the crews, the story of what Unteroffizier Karl Reimann and his men had done on that ridge began to spread. 37 enemy tanks in 15 minutes. Some called it impossible, others said it was luck, others said it was proof of skill and discipline. For Reimann, it was something else, a day he knew he would never fully leave behind.